Again, thank you for participating in this 5-state virtual convention, Spirit of the West. I've enjoyed it thus far. I hope you have as well. This brings us to a rapid fire session. This is meant to be interactive. This is the part of our program where you can exchange questions and answers with our experts in different areas. You've chosen to join us in this session on strategy and strategic risk management and COVID-19 world. Questions every executive should ask and must answer. I'm pleased to have with us Dr. Paul Godfrey. Dr. Godfrey is the William and Raseel Lowe Professor of Business Strategy at the BYU Marriott School of Business. He's been honored with both the school's Outstanding Researcher and Outstanding Teacher awards. As an active researcher, his work has appeared in a number of premier scientific publications, including Nature Biotechnology, the Academy of Management Review, and the Strategic Management Journal. Paul's textbook, Strategic Management, Concepts and Cases, 3rd edition, provides students with a well-written, tools-driven approach to strategy formulation and implementation. In 2019, Paul, along with John Bagala, Kristen Narvez, and Manny Laria, co-authored a book called Strategic Risk Management, New Tools for a Competitive Advantage in an Uncertain Age. Got a copy of it right here. It's a great book. The four have founded Strategic Risk Insights, a boutique firm that leverages their 100 years of experience to help executive teams marry strategy and risk management to thrive in a competitive environment that are increasingly volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Paul received his MBA and PhD degrees from the University of Washington and a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Utah. So I'm excited to have him with us. As I showed you his book, when we get to the end of his deck, he'll share with you his contact information, and anybody who'd like a copy of this book, and I highly recommend it, just shoot him an email, and Utah Bankers Association will be happy to provide you with a copy of this book. So with that, I welcome Paul. Thank you for joining with us. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thanks, Howard. What a wonderful introduction. And everybody, it's really great to be with you this afternoon in this incredibly unique format where we are doing something that we haven't done before, and it's scorching heat in Salt Lake City. I don't know what the temperature is everywhere else, but it's great to be with you. And as Howard talked about, I'm going to be talking about strategy, strategic risk, and a COVID-19 world, some questions that every executive ought to be asking and that everybody needs to figure out the answer to. So let's jump right in and think about where we are with the virus today, sort of tracking the virus. This was us 2.5 months ago, May 17th. We had about 1.5 million cases, and we had 20,000 plus a few new cases every day, and we were at 89,000 deaths for the COVID crisis. And I picked May 17th because that's the time when economies were beginning to open up and states were beginning to hopefully get back to business. This is where we were last Friday, July 31st. We have 4.5 million cases, 67,000 daily cases, and over 153,000 deaths so far. The first thing you notice when you look at this graph is if you look at the July 31st graph, you go, well, it looks like there's less COVID-19 than there was in May, but this is Johns Hopkins cumulative confirmed cases. And what they had to do was change the scale of what the size of each little bubble meant in terms of how many people were infected. Just to give you a frame of reference that we'll all understand, the virus continues to spread at almost an 11% weekly CAGR, which is the virus is still running strong. And even though we're seeing some leveling off in some places, it still continues to threaten. So the first question that most people want to ask about COVID-19 is, when will all this end? when can we get back to normal? And unfortunately, the answer I'm going to tell you right now is much later than most of us anticipate. So let's flesh that out a little bit. So this is the baseline. Each little square here represents 1 million Americans, and this captures the total population of the United States, roughly 330 million people as of 2019. This is the most optimistic case for getting to what's known as herd immunity, which means that enough people have been infected by the virus that it can no longer spread rampantly. So now let's look at the optimistic scenario, best case for getting rid of COVID on herd immunity. What you see is in the best case, there's about 40 million infected Americans, which is about between 8 and 10 times the number of confirmed cases. That's what some of the studies are estimating is the actual penetration of COVID into American society. And each gold square represents 1 million people. And to get to 40% herd immunity, which is the low end for herd immunity that optimists focus on, that's about 131 million people. So now here's the sobering part of that. Today we have about 65,000 infections a day, and people are up in arms. At 75,000 new infections per day, the time to herd immunity is 3 years, 4 months, and 10 days. 3 years, 4 months, and 10 days. Now let's think about the most pessimistic scenario that we have going. Here, we'll take the number of confirmed cases from Johns Hopkins, roughly 5 million, we'll round up, and each red square represents 1 million people that need to be infected with COVID-19 in order to reach herd immunity, and that number is about 271 total Americans being infected. Again, if we assume the same infection rate of 75,000 new infections per day, the time to herd immunity is 8 years, 5 months, and 5 days. That's a lot longer than any one of us anticipate. But now let's think about what would be the impact of a vaccine on herd immunity and on COVID-19. Well, the FDA has indicated that they'll approve a vaccine that proves 50% effective. That means if you inoculate 100 people, 50 of them will in fact be prevented from getting COVID-19 because of the vaccine. So in the optimistic or 40% herd immunity scenario, happy days, a vaccine puts us over the threshold and life gets back to normal. However, in the pessimistic scenario where it takes 70% infection to hit herd immunity, a vaccine leaves us with another 2 years, 5 months, and 3 days before we can get back to normal when COVID-19 is no longer a threat. So that sounds really great or really lousy, depending on which way you want to look at it, but it does raise two critical questions. When will a vaccine receive FDA approval, and how long will it take to vaccinate 330 million people? Right now, the best cases for vaccines, they're in phase 3 clinical trials, which typically take between 1 and 3 years, but we're hoping with the number of patients that we can get that down. Then you've got to go through the FDA approval process. Then you actually have to produce 330 million doses of the vaccine. So that's anybody's guess, but my estimate would be that COVID is going to be a presence at least through Q2 of 2021. And on that outside sort of nasty pessimistic scenario, it's Q1 of 2023. So that's where we are today. And the second question that people really want to know is, how do I lead my business? How do we as a company thrive and not just survive in these trying, challenging times? How do we rise above where we are currently and take our business to a new level? Well, the answer to that, we're going to spend the rest of our time together on, and that's by understanding the nature of COVID-19 and then answering 3 critical questions that are raised by COVID. COVID-19 is an accelerant. COVID-19 is not changing our society in any dramatic ways on its own. what it's doing is accelerating changes, trends, and tendencies that we already saw in society. I was reading an article at lunch from the Wall Street Journal talking about marital stress from COVID-19. And they said, where there's a crack, there's now a rupture. And where there's a rupture, there's now a chasm. So COVID-19 is an accelerant that's accelerating trends that are already taking place. In the business world, that means increased VUCA. And I'm going to explain to you what VUCA means because it's a fairly central element to thinking about strategy and strategic risk. On the social scene, COVID-19 has expanded or exploded the problem of loneliness that people are facing. And in the moral realm, COVID-19 has accelerated a rapidly spreading trend towards unchecked cynicism that faces our society and our culture. Read this in the New York Times on Sunday. Michael Dell, founder of Dell Computers, thinking about 2020, said, people will look back and say 2020 will be a year of great accelerations. And that's because COVID-19 is just like Zippo lighter fluid. It accelerates what's already going on, what's already happening. So let's talk about a VUCA world, the situation we find ourselves in. VUCA stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. So to give you an idea about volatility, I did a study of the Dow Jones Industrial Average from January 1st, 1985 to June 1st of 2020. Now, of that entire 35-year time period, 2020 represents about 1% of the trading days. In that 1% of trading days, we've seen 3 of the top 10 largest single-day losses in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, and we've also seen 2 of the top 10 largest single-day gains. So to put that in perspective, in 1% of the trading days, you've seen 25% of the total largest single-day movements in the Dow Jones Industrial Average. That's volatility. When we think about uncertainty, we need to think no further than the microscopic coronavirus and the question that we discussed earlier. What's the arrival date of a vaccine? It's simply unpredictable. Nobody knows when it's going to happen, but we're all very, very hopeful. Thinking about the complexity of our world and how people who have complex systems thrive in coronavirus, consider the following. Apple Computer coordinates 200 suppliers in 43 countries all across the world, and they only maintain 9 days of physical inventory. That's an incredible supply chain spread out all over the world, incredibly efficient. You'd think it would break down in COVID-19. During Q2 of 2020, Apple's revenue grew 11%. So the world certainly is more complex, and people who can respond with complexity find themselves doing well. In terms of ambiguity, my favorite data is think about tracking COVID-19. What exactly does it mean to say that someone has recovered from COVID-19? Well, if you dig behind the numbers, what you find is the technical definition is you had a positive diagnosis, positive test for coronavirus, and 3 weeks later you were still alive. That presumes you've recovered. That may or may not be true, but this is the world in which we live in and which coronavirus has accelerated. So the question, if you want to thrive as an executive and as a bank leader, how robust are my systems for managing uncertainty? How robust are my systems for managing uncertainty? And what you'll all immediately think of is, well, great, we've got a risk committee at the bank that's really targeted on this stuff. But it's not the risk committee, because uncertainty and risk are fundamentally different entities. Your risk committee has a clear history of hundreds of thousands of events where you can calculate fairly precisely the probability that some outcome is going to occur. And you can also estimate the likely impact of that outcome occurring. So risk allows you to create an expected value, a precise number. With uncertainty, we don't know when there will be a vaccine. There's no precedent for this. The precedent for vaccines are 18 months, but nobody's been dumping this much money and energy into developing one. So uncertainty isn't the job of the risk committee. It's its own separate management challenge. Uncertainty means you have to focus on currents, not waves. Waves are the superficial, the day-to-day operating issues that face your business. There is no greater example in banking of a wave than PPP. It just inundated and swamped bankers in the months of late April through early June, but it's not currents. Currents run deep. Currents are long-term. Currents are the issues are the areas where uncertainty actually lives. So some of the currents that your business might be facing, how do I identify the next generation of bankers to lead us into the future? How do we continue to develop relationships with key stakeholders in the midst of all this technology mediation? So you focus on currents, not waves. Uncertainty is not just about threats, it's also about opportunities. It's about where are the growth opportunities for your bank, not just what do we have to be careful that will kill us. The goal of uncertainty management is to identify key uncertainties, monitor them, manage them, and eventually exploit them. It's answering the question, what's next? What's coming down the pipeline that we need to be worried about next, even though we're inundated with COVID-19? The reality is the capability to manage uncertainty will continue to grow in importance, and those organizations that can manage uncertainty well will have a key source of competitive advantage in their marketplaces. So the second accelerant of COVID-19 is that it's created an isolated, lonely, and atomized population. So social distancing and masks truly combat COVID-19. However, physical distancing exacerbates and accelerates the impact of mobile devices that already have us looking no further than a couple inches in front of us at a square device or a rectangular device. Mask wearing is incredibly helpful, but it limits nonverbal communication, or 85% of the way that we communicate with other people. And in today's environment, mask wearing it fosters a lot of distrust. We don't know if you're wearing a mask or not wearing a mask, exactly what that means. And so these are all things that tend to isolate people. Why does this matter? A Cigna insurance survey earlier this year noted that 61% of Americans rated themselves as always or sometimes lonely. That's the majority of Americans, and that's the majority of your workforce and your customer base. Why does this all matter? Because some colleagues of mine at BYU studied loneliness, and they found out that loneliness will decrease your expected lifespan more than being obese, more than being an alcoholic, or more than living in a highly polluted area. Being lonely takes about 5 years off your life, and that's more than a lot of other hazards in today's world. So loneliness raises its own question, which is, do we have a cathedral culture? The picture that you see is the Cologne Cathedral located in Cologne, Germany. And let me tell you a little bit about the building of the Cologne Cathedral. It rests on a site that's been a Christian worship site since the 4th century of the Common Era. In 1248, the original chapel burned down, and they began construction on today's Cologne Cathedral. The first major section of the cathedral, the choir, was completed 74 years later in 1322, and the entire edifice would not be completed until the year 1880, over 600 years after the beginning of construction in the Cologne Cathedral. So what you had was, you had at the very end of that process, you had 19th century architects and 19th century technology looking at 13th century drawings and 13th century design principles to finish a consistent cathedral. That has significant implications for American business, where the average lifespan of a corporation is about 40 years. So what is a cathedral culture? It's a deep set of values and an enduring organizational purpose and mission that can sustain the organization for millennia. It's very stable. People worked on the Cologne Cathedral to worship their God. They didn't do it just to make a buck. So it has to be deeply value-driven and purpose-driven and incredibly stable. But think about 600 years. A cathedral culture has a mindset and processes for continuous improvement that can deal with change and adaptation, that can deal with dramatically new technologies or dramatically new social conditions. So a cathedral culture is paradoxically incredibly stable and highly adaptive. Cathedral cultures build on 4 elements. Number 1, they build on mission. You've got to be a mission-driven organization and have a clear statement of mission, vision, and values. Second, cathedral cultures always focus on relationships, bringing people together for their own sake, not merely for economic exchanges. Cathedral cultures measure what really matters, those enduring elements of the business that truly drive long-term profitability, stakeholder satisfaction, and cathedral cultures learn from data they collect and things that they experience. So the question number 2 is, do you have a cathedral culture? Because it is the best antidote to social entropy. A cathedral culture gathers people together in meaningful ways and helps fight against loneliness. And having a cathedral culture will allow your bank to thrive in these times of challenge and change. So let's talk about moral meaning. One of the things that COVID-19 has done is absolutely exploded the level of cynicism and conflict that we find in our society. So psychologists talk about 5 elements that you need to have a happy, meaningful life. You need to have positive emotions, joy, satisfaction, fulfillment. Those are swallowed today by fear, anxiety, and pessimism. You need to be deeply engaged in the activities of life and things that you enjoy. Well, that's become tremendously difficult due to social distancing or the closure of many of the activities that we so love to do. For me, that's been the national parks. Relationships have tended to become incredibly transactional during COVID-19 as our trust with one another seems to continue to erode. We now find traditional allies. Think of your kids' teachers, who you hope are your allies in educating, are portrayed today as your enemies in keeping you from getting back to work and being on the job. So these are damages to relationships. Meaning is incredibly difficult to find for many people in the face of the intense suffering and increased death that comes with COVID-19. And achievements that we all hoped for and worked for, so many of them now seem empty and hollow as metrics have changed and as some things have fallen from grace. So the question of cynicism is, does our fundamental optimism shine through? And how does our fundamental optimism shine through? It's my belief that bankers are some of the most optimistic people in the world. It's in your DNA. Why do you lend people money? Because you believe the future for them will be better than the past. Why do you encourage people to save and invest? Because you believe, as they do, that the future will be better than the past. So of all of the industries out there, there should be none more optimistic about the future than bankers, because it literally is the basis of your business to be optimistic about the future. Do optimism and hope pervade your business processes? Now, that's an interesting question that most of you probably haven't thought about. You're thinking about speed, efficiency, cost control. Have you thought about, do optimism and hope infuse all of our business processes? Here are some examples. Banks that engage in financial education to help young people and newly marrieds and older people figure out how to manage their finances, how to manage money in a turbulent world. What about community investments? What is your bank doing to help close the digital divide, which has been brutally exposed as still a permanent feature of our society? Is your bank bringing stakeholders together across the community to grow and thrive as a community? And there's a lot of hard work that you have to do as a bank. You have to foreclose on mortgages. You have to repossess cars. You have to tell people they don't deserve credit or they can't get it. But do you preserve human dignity and provide a sense of hope and optimism through those incredibly difficult but necessary processes? Look, the bottom line is banks have always been and will continue to be trusted institutions in our society, pillars of the community. And those banks that effectively play that role, those are the ones that are going to thrive and not merely survive. So I read this on Monday. This is the Atlantic's September 2020 issue. Notice the hopelessness, how the pandemic defeated America. Financial ruin, sluggish, denuded, bloated, neutered, vulnerable. These were the words that populated the Atlantic's assessment of COVID-19. I don't believe that view. I hold to a much more hopeful view, which I hope you do as well. And the hopeful view is articulated by Warren Buffett. The American miracle, the American magic has always prevailed, and it will do so again. This was Warren in the annual shareholders meeting in April of 2020. And my final question for you that you need to really think about and you need to find an answer is, what role will your bank play? How will your bank be a part of the American miracle and the American magic? And that's the view to surviving and thriving through COVID-19. I'm going to open this up for questions now, and I'm going to leave this up but unshare the presentation. And at the bottom, you'll see my email address. And if you'd like a copy of our book, Strategic Risk Management, New Tools for Competitive Advantage in an Uncertain Age, just send me an email at this email address, Paul_Godfrey at strategicriskinsights.com. Okay, Howard, let's open it up for questions.
Well, we've had a number of requests for the slide deck, and you'll see in your chat a link to where you can click on that and download those slides, and if you want those as well. Again, just shoot him an email, and if you're interested in a copy of his book. Phenomenal presentation, Paul. I've received a lot of positive input. I haven't seen a lot of questions. I think you just mesmerized everybody. But as you were talking, I thought about a lot of different things that I've seen today. Maybe you could share with us a couple of examples of applications where businesses in this uncertainty seem to have hit the target. They're thriving. They've made some good choices, so to speak.
Well, Howard, thanks. Let me pick one from non-banking and one from banking. Outside of the world of banking, one of my favorite companies is a company called Ecolab, an old line manufacturer of sanitation equipment, water purification, healthcare. Ecolab is on the front lines of fighting COVID-19. And what they did in 2020 was they just released their vision for 2030, a set of aggressive visionary goals built on a cathedral culture to help the world conserve water, to help the world become more healthy, to help with food, having plentiful supplies of food. So rather than be down in the mouth, Ecolab has developed a new vision for the next decade. In terms of banks, what I've seen is a number of community banks that have decided that they were going to use the PPP as a way to find new customers and enter new segments. Many banks have experimented with technology, using online lending technology and online communication tools in ways that they never have before. And what they're trying to capitalize on is they're trying to steal the 30% of small businesses that are irritated with their current banker. So there's a lot of interesting, innovative action going on and companies working to thrive and grow in the midst of crisis.
Well, thank you, Dr. Godfrey. I love the accelerant analogy. Well, the reference to the accelerant. We've been dealing with a lot of issues, especially in the area of technology, and I think it's great. A heads up to the bankers to help them understand that this is just going to speed that whole process up. The way people have moved to different channels and interactions, there's a lot of opportunity there. unfortunately, I just got a couple more questions, but we've run out of time. And so I'll leave it at that. Again, Paul Godfrey, his email is in the chat. If you would like a copy of the book, you can click on the link to download the slides. Right now in the general session at 2:15, we're going to hear from Derek White, the Chief Digital Officer from U.S. Bank. So thanks to all for joining us. Thank you, Dr. Godfrey. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Howard, so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.